The fluorescent lights in the United Nations headquarters cast harsh shadows across the marble floors as Dr. Carmen Rodriguez pushed her cleaning cart down the diplomatic corridor, her small frame almost disappearing behind the oversized equipment that had become her constant companion for the past 18 months. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked softly against the polished stone, a sound that had become as familiar to the passing diplomats as the broken English that marked her as just another invisible member of the building's custodial staff. "Excuse me," she said in heavily accented English as Ambassador Jonathan Whitfield strode past her, his Italian leather shoes clicking with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "I clean quick, no make trouble for important people." Whitfield barely acknowledged her presence, his attention absorbed by the urgent phone conversation that had dominated his morning. "Senator Patterson, I understand your concerns, but the situation in Geneva is deteriorating rapidly. We need unified international response, not political grandstanding." Carmen slowed her cleaning, her weathered hands gripping the mop handle as she pretended to struggle with a stubborn stain on the floor. In reality, every word of Whitfield's conversation was being processed by a mind that understood international crisis management better than most of the diplomats who walked these halls daily. "What do you mean 49 hostages?" Whitfield's voice rose slightly, the practiced diplomatic composure cracking under pressure. "How did a simple trade conference turn into an international incident?" The urgency in his tone made Carmen's pulse quicken with the familiar adrenaline of approaching crisis. 18 months of listening to diplomatic conversations had taught her to recognize the difference between routine political theater and genuine emergencies that could reshape international relations. French, Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian speakers among the hostage-takers? Whitfield continued, his face growing pale as he absorbed information that was clearly beyond his expertise. "How the hell are we supposed to coordinate negotiations when we can't even understand what they're demanding?" From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you're intrigued by this unfolding diplomatic crisis, consider subscribing for more stories of unexpected heroes in impossible situations. Carmen positioned herself near the ornate pillar that allowed her to observe Whitfield's increasingly agitated conversation while maintaining the appearance of routine maintenance work. Her keen eyes took in every detail of his body language, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched, the slight tremor in his voice that suggested he was receiving information well beyond his capacity to process. "The Geneva Convention Hotel," Whitfield repeated, clearly taking notes. 49 hostages from 11 different countries, with demands being issued simultaneously in multiple languages that our negotiation teams can't properly translate in real time. Carmen's mop paused mid-stroke. The Geneva Convention Hotel was located in the International District, a symbol of diplomatic cooperation that had hosted countless peace negotiations over the decades. If terrorists had chosen that location for a coordinated multilingual hostage situation, they weren't just seeking random violence, they were making a sophisticated statement about the failure of international communication. "What do you mean the French delegation is refusing to participate unless demands are translated through their own interpreters?" Whitfield's voice carried a note of panic that suggested the political complexities were overwhelming the emergency response. "And the Chinese insist on separate negotiations? This is madness!" The scope of the crisis was becoming clear to Carmen, even as Whitfield struggled to comprehend the logistical nightmare he was describing. Sophisticated terrorists had created a scenario that exploited the fundamental weakness of international diplomacy, the inability to coordinate rapid response when multiple languages and cultural interpretations were involved. As Whitfield ended his call and immediately began dialing another number, Carmen observed his hands shaking slightly as he tried to navigate his phone's contact list. The confidence that had marked his stride moments earlier had evaporated, replaced by the uncertain movements of someone thrust into a situation that exceeded his training and experience. "Director Morrison?" Whitfield said into his phone. "We have a catastrophic situation developing in Geneva. Multiple hostage-takers speaking different languages. making separate demands to different national delegations, and our translation services are completely overwhelmed. Carmen moved closer, pretending to dust the intricate carved details of the marble pillar, while straining to hear every word of the conversation that would determine how the international community responded to this crisis. "No, sir, we can't just use standard diplomatic interpreters," Whitfield continued, his voice tight with stress. "These aren't formal negotiations. They're simultaneous psychological operations conducted in Arabic, Mandarin, French, Russian, and at least 3 other languages we haven't even identified yet." The terrorists' strategy was becoming apparent to Carmen with crystalline clarity. By conducting separate psychological operations in multiple languages, they were preventing the international response teams from developing a coordinated strategy. Each national delegation was receiving different information, different demands, different psychological pressure, designed to create exactly the kind of diplomatic paralysis that Whitfield was now experiencing. 6 hours? Whitfield's voice cracked slightly. "They're giving us 6 hours to coordinate responses from governments that normally take 6 months to agree on lunch menus. And meanwhile, we can't even verify what they're actually demanding because our translators are overwhelmed and the real-time interpretation is breaking down under pressure." Carmen had heard enough to understand the magnitude of the crisis. This wasn't a conventional hostage situation. It was a carefully orchestrated attack on the fundamental structure of international communication, designed to demonstrate how easily multilingual cooperation could be disrupted when subjected to coordinated pressure. 3 hours later, the UN's Crisis Management Center had been transformed into a scene of controlled chaos that reminded Carmen of similar situations she had navigated during her previous career. Situations where lives hung in the balance, while diplomats struggled with communication breakdowns that could have been prevented with proper linguistic coordination. Ambassador Lisa Chen, from the Security Council, stood at the head of the main conference table, her usually composed demeanor showing stress fractures as she attempted to coordinate responses from delegations that were receiving conflicting information about the hostage situation. The Arabic interpreter reports that the hostage-takers are demanding the release of political prisoners from Yemen, Chen announced to the assembled diplomats. But the French interpreter says they're hearing demands about Algeria, and the Chinese interpreter is reporting something completely different about Taiwan. Carmen entered the crisis center with her cleaning supplies, immediately drawing annoyed glances from several ambassadors who were clearly frustrated by any interruption to their emergency deliberations. "Not now," snapped Ambassador Petrov from the Russian delegation, his thick accent betraying his own linguistic insecurity. "We are in crisis mode. Cleaning staff must wait." Sorry, Carmen replied in her broken English, her accent thick enough to make several diplomats wince. "I clean quick, no bother important people with big problems." She began emptying waste baskets around the periphery of the room, her movements efficient but deliberately unobtrusive as she absorbed the ongoing discussions about communication breakdown and coordination failure. "The problem is systematic," Chen continued, clearly struggling to maintain order among increasingly frustrated national representatives. "Each team of hostage-takers is speaking to their respective linguistic groups, making different demands, creating different timelines, and our interpretation services are simply not equipped to handle this level of real-time multilingual crisis management." Ambassador Krauss from Germany leaned forward with visible frustration. "Our interpreters are trained for formal diplomatic negotiations, not psychological warfare conducted simultaneously in 7 languages. We're essentially blind to what's actually happening in that hotel." Carmen paused in her cleaning as she absorbed this information. 7 languages meant a level of coordination that suggested military-grade planning and resources far beyond typical terrorist capabilities. This was psychological warfare designed specifically to exploit the linguistic vulnerabilities of international crisis response. "And meanwhile," added Ambassador Singh from India, "the clock is ticking. 5 hours remaining, and we haven't even established a unified understanding of what we're negotiating for." Carmen had positioned herself near enough to the main display screen to see the crisis timeline, the scattered translation reports, and the increasingly desperate communications from the Geneva site. The pattern was clear to someone with her background. The terrorists were conducting a sophisticated demonstration of how easily international cooperation could be paralyzed when subjected to coordinated linguistic pressure. Perhaps we should consider compartmentalized response, suggested Ambassador Nakamura from Japan. Each delegation negotiates separately in their own language, then we coordinate afterward. That's exactly what they want, Chen replied with barely controlled frustration. Separate negotiations mean separate agreements, separate concessions, and no unified strategy. We'll be negotiating against ourselves. Carmen set down her cleaning supplies and cleared her throat softly, the sound barely audible over the increasingly heated diplomatic discussions. "Excuse me," she said, her broken English somehow carrying more authority than her previous attempts at communication. "Maybe I can help with language problem." The room fell silent with the kind of stunned quiet that follows an unexpected interruption of serious business by someone who clearly doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. Ambassador Chen's expression shifted from surprise to barely controlled irritation. "Ma'am, this is a classified emergency session. Cleaning staff need to—" "I understand classified," Carmen interrupted, her accent still thick but her word choice suddenly more precise. "I also understand Arabic, Mandarin, French, Russian, German, Portuguese and Farsi when people speak them for psychological warfare instead of normal conversation." The silence in the room deepened as diplomats processed what they had just heard. Carmen's English was still heavily accented, but the vocabulary and syntax had shifted in a way that suggested capabilities far beyond what anyone had assumed. Ambassador Petrov was the first to find his voice. "You speak Russian?" Carmen responded in fluent Russian, her pronunciation flawless despite the accent that colored her English. "Yes, and I can tell from your body language that you're not receiving the same information as the other delegations, which means the hostage-takers are conducting separate psychological operations designed to prevent coordination." Petrov's eyes widened as he absorbed both the perfect Russian and the sophisticated analysis of the tactical situation. Ambassador Chen leaned forward, her earlier irritation replaced by sharp curiosity. "You speak Mandarin?" Carmen switched languages effortlessly, her Mandarin carrying the formal tones appropriate for diplomatic discourse. "I speak Mandarin, and I've been monitoring international news feeds about this crisis. The hostage-takers aren't making random demands. They're conducting a coordinated demonstration of linguistic warfare." The precision and fluency of her Mandarin left Chen momentarily speechless. Ambassador Whitfield stood slowly, his earlier panic giving way to something that might have been hope. "Who exactly are you?" Carmen straightened, and suddenly her entire posture transformed. The hunched shoulders of a tired cleaning woman gave way to the bearing of someone accustomed to high-pressure international situations requiring immediate linguistic solutions. "My name is Dr. Carmen Isabella Rodriguez Petrov," she said, her English now crisp and professional, with only the slightest trace of an accent. "I hold doctoral degrees in applied linguistics and international relations from Cambridge University, with additional specialized training in real-time crisis interpretation from the Defense Language Institute." The room erupted in confused murmurs as diplomats struggled to reconcile this revelation with their assumptions about the woman who had been cleaning their offices for 18 months. "That's impossible," Whitfield sputtered. "You're part of the custodial staff." "I'm a senior linguistic specialist on deep cover assignment," Carmen corrected matter-of-factly. "For the past 18 months, I've been monitoring international communications and assessing linguistic vulnerabilities in UN crisis response protocols." Ambassador Singh found his voice. "Deep cover for whom?" "For the same people who are going to hold you responsible if 49 hostages die because international cooperation broke down due to translation failures that could have been prevented," Carmen replied with enough edge to silence further questions about her credentials. She moved to the central conference table and opened her worn notebook, revealing pages of detailed analysis written in multiple languages and scripts. I've been monitoring this crisis since it began, and I can tell you exactly what's happening and why your response efforts are failing." She flipped to a specific page covered with complex linguistic analysis. "The hostage-takers aren't making genuine demands. They're conducting a coordinated psychological experiment designed to demonstrate how easily multilingual crisis response can be disrupted through strategic communication breakdown." "How do you know this?" Chen demanded. "Because I've been translating and analyzing their communications patterns since the crisis began," Carmen replied, producing a small device that had been hidden among her cleaning supplies. "While you've been arguing about interpretation protocols, I've been doing real-time linguistic analysis of their actual statements." She activated the device, bringing up audio recordings and translation matrices that were clearly beyond the capabilities of standard diplomatic interpretation services. "The Arabic speakers are making demands about Yemen, but they're specifically referencing prisoners who were released in an exchange 2 years ago," Carmen explained. "The Mandarin speakers are discussing Taiwan independence, but only in the context of trade agreements that China would never accept under any circumstances." Ambassador Chen frowned as she absorbed this analysis. "Those are impossible demands." "Exactly," Carmen confirmed. "The French demands reference Algerian prisoners who died in custody 3 years ago. The Russian demands involve Ukrainian separatists who are already free. They're asking for things that are either impossible or already resolved." The implications began to dawn on the assembled diplomats as Carmen continued her analysis. "This isn't about prisoner releases or political concessions," she continued. "It's about creating a communication crisis that prevents unified international response while they execute a completely different operation." "Which is?" Whitfield asked. Carmen pulled up satellite imagery on her device, showing movement around the Geneva hotel that had escaped the attention of diplomats focused on translation problems. "While you've been struggling with linguistic coordination, 3 additional teams have taken positions around other diplomatic facilities in Geneva. The hostage situation is a distraction from a much larger operation targeting international infrastructure." The room fell silent as the scope of the deception became apparent. "How do you know about additional teams?" Singh questioned. "Because I've been in communication with field operatives who speak the same languages I do," Carmen replied. "The international intelligence community has better linguistic coordination than the diplomatic community." Chen reached for her secure phone. "I need to contact." "No," Carmen interrupted. "Communications have been compromised since this crisis began. They've been monitoring your phone calls, exploiting the fact that your translations are unreliable and your coordination is fractured." She produced another device from her cleaning equipment. "Use this secure channel. It bypasses the compromised systems they've been using to monitor your responses." As Chen made contact with field operatives, Carmen continued her briefing to the increasingly attentive diplomats. "The beautiful thing about understanding multiple languages," she explained, "is that you start to recognize patterns that aren't visible when you're limited to single language analysis. These hostage-takers made the mistake of assuming that linguistic barriers would create cognitive barriers. But they didn't account for someone who could synthesize information across multiple linguistic frameworks simultaneously," Chen observed as she concluded her secure communications. "Exactly. While they were creating confusion in 7 languages, I was analyzing their patterns in 9. Over the next 2 hours, Carmen orchestrated a response that none of the diplomats had imagined possible. Using her linguistic capabilities and intelligence contacts, she provided real-time translation and analysis that allowed the international response teams to coordinate effectively for the first time since the crisis began. "All teams report ready," Chen announced, as Carmen's coordination began producing results. "Swiss tactical teams are in position. French intelligence has identified the secondary targets, and Russian signals intelligence has isolated the communication networks." "Synchronized response in 3 minutes," Carmen confirmed, monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously while providing interpretation services that kept all national delegations informed of developments in real time. The operation that followed, was a textbook example of international cooperation enabled by effective linguistic coordination. Tactical teams from 4 nations simultaneously neutralized the terrorist operations in Geneva, successfully rescuing all 49 hostages while preventing the secondary attacks that would have caused massive casualties among diplomatic personnel. In the aftermath, as international news services reported the successful resolution of the crisis, Carmen quietly resumed her cleaning duties. Her cover was compromised, but her work at the UN was far from over. Ambassador Chen found her in the corridor 2 hours later, back in her custodial uniform, but moving with the confidence of someone whose extraordinary capabilities had finally been recognized. "Dr. Rodriguez," Chen said formally, "I owe you a profound apology for the way we treated you." "You owe me nothing," Carmen replied, switching back to her accented English with a slight smile. "You responded exactly as you should have to someone whose presence and capabilities were deliberately concealed." "Will you continue working here?" Carmen's smile broadened. "Someone has to keep these floors clean, and someone has to listen to the conversations that happen in these halls in languages that most people don't realize are being spoken." "In how many languages?" "However many it takes to keep people safe," Carmen replied simply. As Chen walked away, Carmen returned to her cleaning cart. Tomorrow would bring new crises, new challenges, new opportunities to use her linguistic skills in service of international peace and security. But tonight, 49 people were alive, because a cleaning lady who spoke 9 languages had understood that effective communication was the foundation of all international cooperation. The most valuable intelligence operatives she had learned long ago were the ones who could become invisible while remaining constantly alert. And in a building full of diplomats who conducted business in dozens of languages, nobody paid attention to the cleaning staff who heard everything and said nothing. That invisibility had been her greatest asset, and even with her cover blown, it would continue to serve the cause of international peace through the simple act of understanding what people were really saying to each other, regardless of which language they used to say it. From which city are you watching this incredible story of linguistic heroism? If Carmen's dedication to protecting lives through the power of communication inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of unsung heroes who use unexpected skills to save the day.